name is Amanda Giorgis, and today I would like to read to you from my first novel, The Wideawake Hat, the first book in the Applecross saga. Based around the true story of James Mackenzie is my interpretation of what may have become of the infamous sheep rustler, after whom the beautiful Mackenzie Basin in New Zealand's South Island is named. The Wideawake Hat tells the story of George and Sophia as they travel from Scotland, arriving in 1848 in Dunedin. They head north to find a place to call their own, and soon become part of a growing community of early settlers. The Wideawake Hat is to be found on Amazon as a paperback or ebook, and from Kobo and Apple Books as an ebook. The passage I'm reading today sees George establishing himself as a sheep farmer, while Sophia cares for their newborn son, Freddie. Towards the end of July, the weather seemed to take a turn for the better, and presuming that all the snow that was going to melt had now done so, George could see the water level dropping. The days were lengthening slowly, so George was able to cross the stream as soon as it was light and spend the day checking his pregnant ewes and seeking out new lambs. Roy happily splashed across the stream and shook from nose to tail on the far bank to remove the water from his coat. He loved scampering between the shrubs and finding sheep. He knew which plants to avoid. The ones with the long spikes were the worst. It really hurt if he caught his paw on one of those low, growing, spreading bushes. And there was a strappy grass-like plant with razor edges. He knew he had to avoid that, and he had the scars to prove it. George would follow him on horseback, occasionally giving him a whistled instruction, and by lunchtime Roy, George and the horse were panting and sweating and in need of a break. On one particular day, George had found a big tree under which he and Roy could sit for their cold lunch. It was only when he sat down that George noticed the grey clouds gathering and the wind rising. By the time he'd eaten his bread and cheese, saving the crusts for Roy, an odd drop of rain had started to fall. He shivered and said to the dog, "We better head home, Roy, before this rain comes." Roy responded with a single bark before setting off in completely the wrong direction. "Come back, you stupid boy," called George, but to no avail. It was clear that Roy had picked up a scent. Pulling his oilskin around him and pushing his brimmed hat firmly down to avoid it flying away in the wind, George mounted his horse and followed the dog. His eyes stung with the rain, which was now falling steadily. Star didn't like the conditions one bit. He tossed his head and shook it from side to side to get rid of the water, which stopped him from seeing where he was going. It was at the very last minute that George found Roy standing to attention, indicating in the direction of a ewe, obviously in distress. Jumping from his horse, George could see a tail hanging down from the rear of the sheep, as she stood panting with discomfort and the effort of a breached birth. "Bother," thought George, "this could take some time." He set to with untying ropes from his saddle and began the job of extracting each leg from the writhing ewe, attaching a rope and pulling as hard as he could. It was strenuous work for George and the ewe. Slowly, he was able to turn the lamb so that the top of its head could be seen. Although the poor ewe was exhausted, she pushed and pushed. All of a sudden, the awkward lamb slithered to the ground in a heap of blood and fluid. George rushed to clear his nose and mouth and rubbed the tiny body vigorously. Expecting to lose a lamb and a mother, it took several minutes before he heard a gasp and a plaintive bleat from the babe. Mother had lain exhausted and lifeless, but she rallied at the sound and turned around to begin the task of licking the new lamb. George stepped back and left them to it. He never ceased in his sense of wonder at the new life starting and the bond between mother and child. It reminded him of Sophia and Freddie. "Roy, we'd better get home before dark, my boy," he had to shout over the storm, which seemed to have intensified in the last few minutes. He could hear thunder rumbling over the hills, and the rain hit him like slaps in the face as it fell in sheets whipped sideways by the wind. He struggled to mount his horse, who by now was fairly spooked by the weather. Darkness was but half an hour away, and he cursed at not bringing a lantern, fully expecting to be home in daylight. They made slow progress. Even Roy had slowed to a crawl with muddy paws and sodden coat. He was a miserable dog and yearned for his warm, dry bed, but he wouldn't dream of leaving his master's side. As the sorry-looking group approached the stream, George heard the roaring of the water before he could see how fully it was running in the stream. Crossing was going to be difficult. He could see a light in the house across the water, but the river had become a raging torrent. Should he find shelter on the bank, or should he try to get home? George was tired, cold and hungry. He decided he needed to be home. He certainly didn't want Sophia to come looking for him in these conditions. The crossing point that he'd spent so much time building was nowhere to be seen. The lack of light made it hard to find a suitable place for his horse to enter the water. If he could find a safe step down the bank, George thought they could wade through carefully. He called Roy to jump up on the saddle. Roy liked travelling this way normally, but he wasn't too sure about his slippery seat today. Nevertheless, he wasn't brave enough to swim across, so he would take up his seat, tummy across the saddle in front of his master. George had been aware of lightning flashes behind him, followed a few seconds later by thunder, which seemed to rumble on for minutes at a time. Rain still fell, and the wind blew in huge gusts. He thought he'd found a good place. He clicked his teeth and pushed his heels in to make his ride step forward. Bravely, the horse put his front feet down onto the slippery bank and prepared to take the next leap into the water. But just as he was about to jump, a huge flash of lightning lit up the sky with a crackle, followed almost immediately by rolling thunder. It was just too much for the poor beast. He reared up with eyes rolling and nose snorting, white flecks of saliva everywhere. With only his back legs for traction, there was no way he could stay upright, and he fell sideways into the raging torrent, tipping George and Roy in too. To find out what happens next, please look out for the Wideawake Hat on Amazon, Kobo or Apple Books. You will also find the second book in this Applecross saga, Shepherd's Delight. Number 3 is due for publication later in the year. Thank you, and keep safe and well everyone.